Hello, I'm Rosalind Esche of dearreader.blog. Welcome to our Crime Scene podcast, which focuses on crime fiction writers. Today's conversation is part 2 of a 4-part interview with Graham Bartlett, retired police officer turned author and advisor to crime writers, about his police career and his second calling as a writer. Graham and I met up in Goldsborough Books in Brighton, and I started by asking him what he thought about the state of our criminal justice system.
I think the theoretical model of our criminal justice system is very good in terms of, the onus is on the prosecution to prove beyond doubt that the defendant is guilty. There are some obligations on the defence to flag up what their defence is likely to be, and there's disclosure obligations both ways. I think the way in which the bureaucracy of it, I think, designs in justice denied for people. I think when you know, particularly now when you've got such a backlog because of COVID, that you're not going to get somebody to trial for a year at least. It is terrible, and you've got in a lot of those cases you've got innocent people on remand in prison, who may be acquitted.
Yes.
And they'll if they are acquitted, they'll just be told, "Oh, you're free to go," and there's no comeback for them.
No.
I don't think prison is. I think prison's a good place to protect the public. So putting violent people in there, putting sexual offenders in there, because I think the public do need protection. I think as a mode of punishment and rehabilitation, I just think it just doesn't work. I think you look at people that are in prison for non-violent offences, for offences against justice in some cases. So for the contempt of court or something like that. I'm not saying they shouldn't be punished, but is that really a place for somebody? Fraudster, is that really a place for them? A white collar criminal, putting them in prison for 5 years. What's that actually doing? The way to hurt people, fraudsters, is to go after their money.
Yes.
Go after their assets.
Yes.
And that's what's really going to hurt them. But it's just a very expensive kind of warehouse, really. And more often than not, people that go in come out worse.
And we have more, don't we, than most countries in Europe at any rate? Don't we have more people in prison?
Certainly than Europe, I believe. Not the States. I mean, in the US, it's the population of a small city are in custody in the US. But we tend to use it with impunity and for no good reason.
And there are better methods of dealing with certain people, aren't there? And so you're fairly jaded about any rehabilitation that could take place in prisons. You don't believe that works?
No, I don't. I don't think it works. I think you have to have quite a long sentence to even get on the first rung of rehabilitation in prison. No, short sentences don't work. If you're a drug addict and you commit a theft or a robbery or something like that, and you get 6 months, you're getting no rehabilitation in there. You're probably going to get your hands on more drugs in there than you could out, and you're going to come out without a job, without a home, without money, possibly without a family, and with a raging drug habit. And there's one place you're going, and that's back again, and it's just crazy. I get very agitated about that.
Yeah. Are they just sort of shoved out the door and that's it? There's no support at all?
Well, no, they have the probation. After I can't remember what the sentences are, but I think it's about a year. After a year, if they've been in custody or been sentenced to a year, they come out on licence. But under a year, they come out at the halfway point and they get post-sentence supervision, which is it's not on licence, but it's probation keeping an eye on them. They don't really do anything much other than to kind of just make sure they're not offending and they're living where they're supposed to live. They can't, they're as underfunded as everybody else.
And how can drugs be so prevalent in prison? I mean, how does that even happen?
Well, I mean, there's so many ways of getting drugs in. They prison officers themselves will tell you, despite they have these chairs that visitors sit on, and they're supposed to X-ray and find drugs or phones or whatever. They even get that even gets through. I mean, there's talk of prison officers bringing in spice, which is synthetic cannabis, can be liquefied and then what happens sometimes is that somebody will make a kid's drawing and send it in as if, oh look, your little boy's made, done you a nice painting, and actually the paint is all kind of infused with spice. So quite some prisoners, they'll photocopy those, or anything that comes in like that, they'll just photocopy it and give the inmate the photocopy. It's just, they're so imaginative. The one thing that prisoners have got is time, and they can work
time
out.
to think about.
Exactly, yeah.
And what about, I hate to have to ask about things like this, but about corruption? I mean, do you think that's not as rife as people and dramas on TV like to portray?
I don't think it is as rife. I think there is corruption, as there is in local government, in national government, because it's human beings. But I think, from my experience, is that corruption is on an individual basis rather than an endemic basis. I think, there have been examples of kind of, big squads that have been corrupt in the 70s and 80s, but I think now it's more the individual, and certainly the corrupt officers that I know of that have been dismissed and sent to prison have been working very much on their own, and it's been kind of, I say low level. No corruption is low level, but it's not. No one's sort of buying big kind of manor houses in the country or driving Rolls Royces. It's almost, it's quite pathetic, really. The worst kind of corruption really is mishandling of evidence and filling people up, and there's quite a lot of safeguards around that now, but that's always a worry for me. The innocent going to prison.
And what's a very hard question to answer, but what's the most memorable case you worked on, or the most important, or?
Probably not the most important, because I think that any crime is important to the victim. So it would be hard to pick out one like that. I suppose. I worked on the Russell Bishop case. Which I've written about, but another one which always stuck with me was, and I wrote about this in Death Comes Knocking. It was a chap who ran a business. He ran a pizza shop in Hove, and he was locking up one night. He ran it with his partner. They were a lovely couple, really unassuming, and as they got home, she got out of the car to go and unlock the door, and he parked the car, and then he got jumped and then taken away in his car by two people and beaten almost to death, left blind, very, very nearly died, and that was all for a couple of £100, because they went back to they wanted his safe keys really, and they went back to the shop and emptied the safe and didn't know he'd done the banking on the Friday instead of the Monday, so there was hardly any money in there, and he was left. And I actually met him. I went to see him when I was writing Death Comes Knocking, and they're still living in the same flat, still together. It's just amazing sense of humour and humility, and just getting on with life. But
didn't he have life-changing injuries?
He lost his sight. And I remember when we were sitting in court, there's a process called warrant of further detention. When you want to keep people in custody longer than 36 hours, you have to go to court, and a magistrate has to grant that. So we were behind the prosecutor, and it was had old style kind of Nokia phones in those days. I was literally waiting for somebody to text me to say he died, and that we were changing the investigation to a murder, so I could brief the prosecutor, and he didn't die, thank goodness. But very. And one of the people that did it had no previous convictions at all, and the one that did it only had a couple for burglary. It stuck with me for a long time.
Yes, got that impression. I read those books and also watched that documentary Peter did about the babes in the wood.
Yeah.
So many police officers say how things haunt them for their whole lives, that they never ever forget certain crimes, and it lives with them.
Yeah, certainly Babes in the Wood one lives with everybody that was involved in that. It's none of us, which was interesting when I wrote the book with Peter, because I couldn't speak to everybody, And so many people wrote to me afterwards, go, oh, you should have spoken to me. I was a scene guard here. I'd have had something to tell you. Everyone's got a story about it, and sometimes you just have to just go, but I had 90,000 words. That's all I had to tell the story. I could have gone on forever otherwise.
Did you ever get sort of jaded and cynical? Do you think it's inevitable in years and years in the police, seeing the worst of human nature? Does it make you really jaded?
Yeah, I don't think I ever got jaded. I think I kind of, not much surprised me after a while. You kind of hear of some of the things people do or the lengths they go to scam each other or hurt each other, and not a lot really surprised me. I'm not saying I'd heard it all before, but it's just like, oh, that's what they're doing now, is it? I'm right, okay. So you do get a bit like that, but I think certainly it's the way I was trained and sort of tutored and brought up. Really, it was that always trying to put the victim and the family at the centre of everything. So you can't afford to be dismissive about anything. Even if what we used to call a bad on bad crime. Where somebody attacks a rival criminal or something like that. At the end of the day, there's still someone's son, daughter, brother, partner, whatever, and you kind of try and think about the impact on the family as much as you do on the individual.
Because you're seeing the worst of human nature most of the time, aren't you? It must be quite hard to keep all of that in mind. But the families aren't responsible, are they?
No, but sometimes the families are, they're problematic as well. But they still hurt. If you've got to go and tell someone that their son or daughter has been murdered or died in a kind of horrific car crash or something like that, where someone was driving in a ridiculous manner, however much they might hate the police and been in the wrong side of the law, they still cry and they still they still want you not to be telling them that, and they'll still live with that moment. Sometimes I don't dwell on it, but sometimes I think of all the death messages I've given, and I know that every one of those people will always remember every syllable. They might not remember every syllable, they certainly remember me and me knocking on the door and what I told them. They'll never forget that police officer's knock, whether they be holier than thou or somebody who spent half their life in prison. They all cry, they all hurt.
Did you dread doing that? Was that one of the worst things you had to do?
Yeah, I didn't. It was horrible. You walk up to somebody's house, and sometimes you'd see them, like you'd see a silhouette behind a curtain or something moving around, or the curtain might be open, and you'd see them like watching the telly or taking a cup of tea or a drink or something, and you just think, I'm just about to devastate your life, and you don't know that yet. You're sitting there, life is rosy. I'm about to crush you with what I'm going to have to tell you. And sometimes, the reactions could vary hugely. I mean, I've been attacked for giving a message before. Just because they're not attacking me. No. They just don't want me to say what I'm saying. They don't want to believe it. So you don't take it personally or anything like that. But I've been attacked, and sometimes I've sat there for hours and hours and hours because they've not wanted me to go, and I've not felt that I could go, and sometimes you think, is that professional to just keep staying there? Well, I know what I'd want. I just think that I'd owe it to someone, and I never got criticised for it, but you know that while you're sitting there, you're not answering all the other jobs on that are coming over the radio, but I think you've just got to do what you're doing the best way that you can. But
did you ever see? It's a little off the point, but did you ever see that Code of a Killer drama about Alec Jeffreys?
Oh yeah.
It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Really brilliant drama.
John Sim, wasn't it?
John Sim. He plays Alec Jeffreys, and David Threlford plays David. I can't remember the.
Stevenson, wasn't it?
Is that what it was?
The police officer.
And he. Throughout that, he goes and sits with the family, doesn't he? This goes on for years, doesn't it? Because they don't solve it at first. But he visits them and he visits the grave, and he's always part of their lives. I found that very moving. And from what you're saying, presumably that does happen.
It does, not in every case. You wouldn't have time to do it in every case, and you wouldn't have the inclination. But some cases you do. I remember it's not quite the same. Well, it's not the same thing, but it's the same kind of the same motivation behind it. It was my old boss here, Malcolm Bacon, who was a sexual inspector, dealt with a child death, and the police and the prosecution couldn't prove whether it was the mum or the dad that did it. One of them did it. One of them was guilty of murder, and one of them wasn't guilty of murder, but they might have been guilty of lots of other things. So they both got acquitted, and they both because you've got to prove it beyond reasonable doubt against each one. And he got the law changed. He just made it his life's ambition to lobby government and get the law changed. And we're very lucky because in Brighton there was Lord Bassam, who was one of the Home Office ministers, was a ex-Brighton leader of the council. So he used him to sort of start this debate going, and they created an offence of causing or allowing the death of a child, which now carries, I can't remember what sense it carries. It's not the same as murder, but it carries significant custodial sentence. And people are now being, where both parents don't say anything, people are being convicted of that now, and that's all good. Down to Malcolm Bacon. And it's and you just think that came out of one case where he just felt this huge injustice for this child that had died, and just made it his life's ambition to stop that happening again. Yeah.
Have you ever had a case where you knew someone was guilty and they got off, and it was terribly frustrating and awful? And
the obvious one is Russell Bishop.
Yeah.
That's the obvious one. I've had serious assaults and burglaries, and where people have got off, and you kind of just have to kind of brush yourself down, really. It's quite hard to adopt the mindset that your job is to get it to court. There are so many checks and balances before you get it to court. So you have the CPS have to approve the charge first of all, and then they have to continually review it so that they're satisfied there's sufficient evidence. It has to be, if it gets to trial, judge has to agree that there's sufficient evidence for it to continue.
Yeah.
When the prosecution case is finished, the judge can, if the defence asks, then the judge can determine whether or not there is a case to answer, whether the prosecution have done enough. So if you get to the point where the jury, are walking back in, you've actually done all you can.
Yeah.
There's nothing really more to do, and so you can't dwell on it. But it does hurt. Again, for the victims, it does hurt.
Yes.
And particularly when you're trying to explain to the victims that it's not about belief. Particularly if it's a personal crime like a rape or something like that. It's not that the jury didn't believe you. It's just that they couldn't be sure. And it's that only the element of doubt. So because not guilty doesn't mean innocent. There's in Scotland they haven't, but they have a not proven. Yeah. So which is our equivalent of not guilty. But if you're found innocent in Scotland, you're found innocent, and you're innocent. Here, not guilty is not innocent, and you hear people on the court steps sometimes going, "I've been found innocent by the jury." Well, you haven't. You've been found not guilty.
That's a really interesting distinction, which I think people don't understand. I certainly didn't really think about that.
Yeah.
A lot of us wouldn't realise that.
Yeah, no, it's the standard of proof is mountainous, and if you don't reach the summit of that, it's not guilty. It doesn't mean you're not a climber. It doesn't mean you're not brilliant. Haven't produced you've only got to have the defence be able to sow a seed of doubt in the jury's mind, and sometimes if the judge is insisting on a majority verdict, a unanimous verdict, then you've only got to seed that in one of the jurors' minds, and you best get hung jury.
Yes, and going back to the Bishop one, it's interesting that eventually, because of improvements and progress in forensics, he was then finally found guilty, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the law changed first. That was the first thing. The law changed, which meant that in serious cases like murder and rape and robbery and kidnap, if there was significant new evidence, then the Court of Appeal can quash the acquittal and order a retrial.
Yes.
Now that's only been in place since 2005. So that happened, and then science then caught up and meant that the minute forensic samples that were gathered in 1986 were re-examined. Yeah, there was, well, it was DNA within the tapings. So they taped Karen's skin to really look at, they are looking for fibres and hair and stuff like that. But in doing that, they're also taping. They don't realise it because it's 1986, but they're taping skin particles off there.
Yes.
And in those skin particles were Russell Bishop's DNA, and the first part of the prosecution case was to prove that there's no way that Russell Bishop had any opportunity to touch Karen Hadaway's naked arm legally. So he'd seen her during the course of the day, but she'd been wearing a jumper then, so couldn't have got through then, didn't touch her, was stood away from her. So there was no other way other than during the murder that his DNA could have ended up on her skin. But that was, that trial was in 2018, and I think that evidence came through in 2015, 2016. So, long time after the murders.
And prior to that, there'd been a problem with the window of time, hadn't there, that seemed to be fixed. And
yeah, that was the prosecution's fault, really. Nowadays, the prosecution don't really kind of tie themselves down to times unless they can be. Well, it used to be the convention. Everyone wanted the time of death. Oh, you got to give us time of death, and they go to the pathologist, and the pathologists were more inclined in those days to kind of bow to that pressure. So they go, between 6:30 and 7 or something like that. But nowadays, you ask a pathologist the time of death, and they'll say, well, it's between the time they were last seen and when they were found dead. That's kind of how they frame it.
That was nothing to do with the police and their evidence.
No. In fact, the police had gathered evidence which discounted that time of death, because they had a witness who knew the girls, who was waving to them at 6:45.
So why wasn't that taken more into account than?
Well, that's something that we kind of ask in the book is, why? Because it's just, you're backing yourselves into a corner, and the prosecution counsel did that, with the CPS, and as far as I'm aware, and I've spoken to the senior investigating officers, there was no one picked up on it until it was too late, and then the judge. So a lot of people criticise the judge in that case, and I think there are some questions about the judge, but I think one of the at the end of the day, the judge has to direct the jury based on the case that the prosecution present, and the prosecution presented the case that the girls were dead by 6:30. So the judge can only present that to because that's what the prosecution case is, and notwithstanding that there was somebody that saw them at 7:15.
So the police provide all their evidence and hand it over, and then the prosecution.
Yeah, they work with the police, and they, but at the end of the day, the barrister, the leading counsel will decide how he or she is going to conduct the case, and that's how they decided to do it.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of this 4-part interview